The Cold War did not end. That is the first thing you need to understand before any of this makes sense. The treaties were signed. The wall came down. The flags changed over government buildings from Moscow to Warsaw to Bucharest. Generals shook hands. Diplomats smiled in front of cameras. And then they went back to their offices and left most of the infrastructure exactly where it was. The silos remained. The submarines stayed on patrol routes that had been rehearsed 10,000 times. The warning systems kept scanning the horizon. And the doctrine that had been built across 4 decades to guide the destruction of civilization in an organized and procedurally correct manner, that doctrine did not go anywhere either. It sat in filing cabinets and server banks, and the institutional memory of men who had spent their careers learning to manage the end of the world as though it were a logistics problem. What you have been told about the Cold War is technically accurate and fundamentally misleading. You were told it was a standoff, a balance of terror. 2 superpowers staring each other down across a chessboard until one of them blinked. That framing makes it sound controlled. It makes it sound like the people at the top were always in charge, always deliberate, always aware of what was happening and why. The truth is messier and quieter and far more unsettling than any dramatized version of events could convey. The truth is that the Cold War was managed, not won or lost, but managed, the way a chronic illness is managed, with protocols and medications and contingency plans for when the protocols failed, and contingency plans for when those failed too. And buried inside that management structure were systems, real physical and procedural systems that were designed to function without human judgment at precisely the moment when human judgment would be most needed. Some of those systems were never officially acknowledged. Some were acknowledged and then quietly retired without ever being fully explained. Some were acknowledged, retired, and then discovered to have continued operating after their official retirement. Some are still classified. And some, the ones that will stay with you longest, were accidents. Not accidents in the sense that people made mistakes, though that happened too, but accidents in the sense that the system worked exactly as designed and the outcome was still nearly catastrophic. The difference between those 2 kinds of failure is important. A mistake can be corrected by better training, better procedures, better people. A system that works as designed and still nearly ends civilization is a different problem entirely. It means the design was wrong. It means the people who built it were operating from assumptions that did not survive contact with reality. And it means that the near misses you are about to hear were not anomalies. They were features. We begin in the desert. In the late 1940s, the United States was the only country on Earth with functional nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. This was understood by American planners not as a temporary condition, but as a strategic window that needed to be exploited before it closed. The assumption was that the Soviet Union would develop its own bomb within 5 to 10 years. The Soviets did it in 4. When they tested their first device in August of 1949, the American response was not panic exactly, but it was something close to institutional vertigo. The entire strategic framework had been built on the premise of American nuclear monopoly. That premise was now gone. What replaced it over the next several years was a system of mutual assured destruction that was articulated clearly enough in public, but was far more elaborate and far more precarious in its actual operational details. The first of the banned or deeply suppressed Cold War systems to understand is not a weapon, it is a targeting philosophy. Before the doctrine of mutual assured destruction was formalized, American nuclear planners operated under something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. The earliest versions of this plan, developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, called for the simultaneous delivery of thousands of nuclear warheads against Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern Bloc targets in a single coordinated strike. The plan was not designed to be proportionate. It was not designed to respond to a specific threat with a specific level of force. It was designed to be total. The first version, SIOP 62, called for the use of over 3,000 nuclear weapons against more than 1,000 targets. The projected casualties were in the hundreds of millions. The plan made no distinction between military targets and civilian ones in any meaningful operational sense, because at the scale of nuclear exchange being contemplated, the distinction was irrelevant. What made the PSYOP system particularly significant from a historical standpoint was not its scale, but its inflexibility. The plan was designed to be executed as a package. There were very limited options for selective strikes or graduated responses in the early versions. If the plan was activated, it was activated in its entirety. This meant that the decision to respond to a Soviet first strike or to launch preemptively if warning systems indicated an incoming attack was effectively a decision to kill hundreds of millions of people, regardless of what had actually happened or why. The men responsible for implementing the plan were not monsters. They were professionals who had been given a professional problem and had solved it professionally. The problem was that the solution made catastrophic overreaction structurally inevitable. The PSYOP was not banned in the conventional sense. It was revised repeatedly over the following decades as administrations came and went and strategic thinking evolved. But the core logic, the idea that nuclear response should be massive, coordinated and pre-scripted, persisted long after its limitations were understood. Civilian officials who were briefed on the early versions of the plan were often visibly shaken. One senior official who reviewed PSYOP 62 reportedly said that it was simply a plan to use everything we have as soon as we can. That was not an exaggeration. What came next in terms of institutional evolution was the attempt to introduce flexibility into a system that had been designed for totality. This led directly to the development of what planners called limited nuclear options, or LNOs. The theory was that if the United States could credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons in a limited and proportionate way, it would have more deterrent leverage and more room to maneuver in a crisis. The problem was that no one could convincingly demonstrate that a limited nuclear exchange would stay limited. The command and control systems of both superpowers were designed to detect nuclear detonations and respond to them. A limited strike that destroyed a Soviet radar installation or an airfield might be intended as a signal, but the Soviet systems receiving that signal had no way to interpret it as limited. They would see nuclear detonations on their territory and respond according to their own pre-scripted plans. This is where the second suppressed system becomes relevant. The Soviet Union developed, over the course of the 1970s and into the 1980s, a command and control system that Western analysts came to call dead hand, and that Soviet officials referred to internally as perimeter. The system was designed to solve what was, from a Soviet strategic perspective, a genuine and serious problem. Soviet leadership was heavily centralized. Nuclear launch authority resided with a very small number of people at the top of the political and military hierarchy. If those people were killed in an American first strike, the Soviet deterrent might be paralyzed. The missiles existed but could not be launched because there was no one with the authority to launch them. Dead hand was the solution to that problem, and it was a solution that, once understood in the West, caused a level of institutional alarm that was carefully managed away from public view. The perimeter system worked by continuously monitoring for signs of nuclear attack. It monitored seismic sensors for the distinctive signatures of nuclear detonations. It monitored radiation detectors. It monitored communication systems to determine whether Soviet command and control networks were still functioning. If the system detected what it interpreted as a nuclear attack and simultaneously determined that Soviet leadership was no longer reachable, it would automatically authorize the launch of nuclear missiles without any further human decision being required. There were human elements in the loop, in the sense that the system was activated by human beings and monitored by human beings in an underground bunker. But the final authorization could proceed without anyone at the top of the chain of command being alive or responsive. The existence of this system was not acknowledged by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was not acknowledged by Russia until the early 1990s, when a former Soviet general confirmed its existence in a conversation with an American journalist. The American response to this confirmation was not the alarm you might expect. There was alarm, certainly, among the small number of officials who were briefed on the details. But the institutional response was largely to absorb the information and continue. The system existed. It had presumably been operating for some years. The deterrence relationship between the superpowers had survived its existence so far. The policy implication was unclear, so the information was managed. What made Dead Hand particularly significant was not just its automation, but its philosophy. The system was built on the assumption that human decision-making under nuclear attack conditions could not be trusted, not because the humans were incompetent, but because they might be dead. The solution to the unreliability of human judgment was to remove human judgment from the final step of the process. This was a logical solution to the problem as it had been defined. The problem was that the problem had been defined in a way that made the solution seem more rational than it was. The deeper question, the question of whether a system capable of launching nuclear weapons without human authorization was itself a problem, was not seriously engaged in the institutional context in which the system was built. The third system in this account is American, and it is in some ways more troubling than Dead Hand because it was not designed as a last resort. The Permissive Action Link, or PAL, was a technological system designed to prevent the unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. This sounds straightforwardly prudent, and in its mature form it was. But the history of PAL is a history of the gap between policy and implementation that defined much of the American nuclear program during the Cold War. In the 1950s and early 1960s, American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe were stored at forward bases under conditions that, by any contemporary security standard, would be considered shockingly permissive. The weapons were physically accessible to base commanders and, in some cases, to lower-ranking personnel who had the technical knowledge to arm them. The codes required to authorize a nuclear launch were, in some documented instances, set to sequences so simple that they amounted to no security at all. The famous example, confirmed in declassified documents, is that the Minuteman missiles were for many years kept on a launch-ready status with a permissive action link code of 000080. The reasoning, as explained by Air Force personnel who were aware of the practice, was that a code that could not be easily remembered or quickly entered in a crisis was a code that might delay launch by crucial seconds. The security of the weapons against unauthorized use was considered secondary to the speed of their availability. This was not a rogue practice. It was institutional. The Air Force had received guidance from civilian authorities about the importance of preventing unauthorized use, and it had implemented that guidance in a way that technically satisfied the requirement while functionally nullifying it. The story of PAL is the story of how bureaucratic systems adapt to directives they find inconvenient by complying in form rather than substance. The fourth system that belongs in this account is the American military satellite network that formed the foundation of nuclear early warning during the Cold War. The system itself was not suppressed, but the incidents associated with it were, and those incidents illuminate the terrifying gap between what these systems were designed to do and what they actually did. The most significant documented incident occurred on the night of November 9, 1979. A technician at the North American Aerospace Defense Command facility at Colorado Springs arrived for his shift and was almost immediately confronted with a scenario that the system was designed to detect and respond to. The early warning displays showed a massive incoming Soviet missile attack. Hundreds of missiles appearing to be on trajectories toward targets across the United States. The duty officer immediately escalated. Within minutes, senior officials were being awakened. The president's military aide was alerted. Bomber crews across the country were being scrambled to their aircraft. Ground-based nuclear launch systems went to a higher state of alert. All of this happened in the space of several minutes, because several minutes was approximately the amount of time that would be available to respond to an actual Soviet first strike. The attack was not real. A training tape, a scenario created for simulation exercises, had been accidentally loaded into the live warning system. The system had processed the training data as though it were real sensor input, and had responded accordingly. The humans at every level of the chain had responded according to their training and procedures. Everything had worked exactly as designed. The attack had never existed. The incident on November 9, 1979 was not the only one of its kind. A similar event occurred less than a year later, in June of 1980, when a failed computer chip, a single component worth less than $1, caused the early warning system to display erratic and alarming data, suggesting multiple incoming missiles. On that occasion, the response followed the same general pattern: escalation, scrambling, the beginning of notification procedures, and then the realization that the data was false. The chip was replaced, procedures were reviewed, and the system continued operating. What these incidents illustrate, and what was carefully managed in how they were communicated to the public, was that the early warning system was not reliable in the way that the public was implicitly led to believe. The system was designed to detect an incoming attack with high confidence in a matter of minutes. The reality was that the system could generate high-confidence alerts that were completely false, and the response procedures, which had been built around the assumption that high-confidence alerts were reliable, were activated by those false alerts in ways that brought the situation very close to irreversible escalation. The fifth system to consider is not electronic, but organizational. The command and control arrangements for American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe during the Cold War created a structure of authority that, under crisis conditions, would have been extraordinarily difficult to manage. American nuclear weapons were deployed across multiple NATO countries under what was called a dual-key arrangement, meaning that both American and host nation authorization was required for their use. In theory, this created a check on unilateral action. In practice, the arrangements were far more complicated than the dual-key description suggested. Some weapons were stored at bases where the physical security was provided by host nation forces who had their own command structures and their own understandings of when those weapons might legitimately be used. Some weapons were assigned to aircraft belonging to host nation air forces, meaning that the pilots who would deliver them were not American citizens operating under American military law, but European officers operating under their own national command structures. The question of who actually controlled these weapons under genuine crisis conditions was not clearly answered by the formal arrangements, and the informal arrangements that had evolved to fill the gaps in formal authority were not always consistent with American policy as understood in Washington. The sixth system, and one of the most consequential in terms of its potential impact, was the American Nuclear Command Aircraft Program. The idea was straightforward. If ground-based command and control facilities were destroyed in a Soviet first strike, the ability to direct nuclear forces could be maintained by airborne command posts that would survive by virtue of being in the air and mobile. The aircraft selected for this role, the E-4B and its predecessors, were highly capable and represented a genuine addition to the survivability of the command structure. What was less publicized was the operational reality of maintaining airborne command posts on continuous alert. The aircraft had to be ready to take off on extremely short notice. The crews had to be trained, rested, and immediately available at all times. The communication systems had to be maintained in a state of constant readiness. And the doctrine for how these aircraft would actually direct nuclear forces in the aftermath of an attack on American territory was worked out in exercises that occasionally revealed significant gaps between theory and practice. The exercises that exposed these gaps were classified. The gaps themselves were never fully resolved. The seventh system involves the Soviet submarine fleet and the protocols under which Soviet ballistic missile submarines operated during the Cold War. Soviet submarine captains operated under considerably more autonomous authority than their American counterparts in certain respects, and the communication arrangements between Soviet submarines on patrol and Soviet command authorities were substantially less robust than American systems. This created situations in which Soviet submarines were operating with nuclear weapons under conditions where they had very limited ability to receive orders from Moscow and where their own operational protocols gave them significant discretion. The most significant documented incident in this category occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, and it was not publicly known until many years after the fact. A Soviet submarine designated B-59 was operating in the waters near Cuba when it was detected and subjected to signaling depth charges by American naval forces. The American depth charges were relatively small and were intended as a signal to the submarine to surface and identify itself, not as an attack. But the crew of B-59 did not know this. They were deep enough that they had lost communication with Moscow. They did not know whether a war had already started. They had been at sea for weeks under difficult conditions. Their carbon dioxide levels were rising. Their captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed that a war might already be underway and that the depth charges were the opening phase of an attack on his submarine. B-59 was equipped with a nuclear torpedo. Its use required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the submarine flotilla commander, who happened to be on board for this particular voyage. Captain Savitsky gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. The political officer agreed. The flotilla commander, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His refusal was the deciding factor. The torpedo was not launched. B-59 surfaced and eventually returned to the Soviet Union. The American naval officers who had conducted the depth charge signaling operation did not know they had nearly triggered a nuclear exchange. The Soviet officials who later reviewed the incident understood exactly what had happened. The incident was classified. It remained classified until participants began speaking about it decades later. The American government was officially informed of the full details of what had nearly happened only in 2002, at a conference in Havana, attended by former officials from both governments and from Cuba. The 8th system in this account is the American Distant Early Warning Line, known as the DEW line, a network of radar installations stretching across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland to Iceland. The DEW line was designed to provide warning of Soviet bomber attacks approaching over the polar route, which was the most direct path between Soviet territory and American cities. The system was built in the late 1950s and represented an enormous engineering and logistical achievement under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The DW line generated false alarms. This was expected and understood by its operators. The radar systems were sophisticated but not infallible, and the Arctic environment created anomalous propagation conditions that could make large formations of geese appear, briefly, like formations of bombers. There were documented instances of DEW line operators reporting contacts that required escalation before they could be identified as meteorological phenomena or wildlife. Each of these incidents required a chain of notifications and assessments that, if they had continued to the point of a launch decision, would have been irreversible within minutes. The 9th system is the Soviet Duga radar network, sometimes called Steel Yard by Western analysts and referred to in Soviet documents as the ARC. The Duga was an over-the-horizon radar system designed to detect ballistic missile launches from the continental United States at ranges that conventional radar could not cover. The system worked by bouncing radar signals off the ionosphere and detecting the reflections of those signals. It was enormously powerful, and its emissions were strong enough to be audible on shortwave radio receivers around the world as a distinctive, repetitive tapping, which gave it the informal name the Russian woodpecker among amateur radio operators. The Duga system was problematic from its inception. Over-the-horizon radar technology was at the edge of what was technically feasible, and the Duga installations experienced persistent problems with false detections. The system's most significant documented false alarm occurred in September of 1983, when the Duga's companion satellite warning system, rather than the radar itself, detected what it interpreted as 5 American Minuteman missiles launched from a site in the western United States. The operator on duty, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, was responsible for assessing the alert and reporting it to his superiors. His assessment would determine whether the Soviet command structure was notified of an apparent American nuclear strike. Petrov looked at the data. The system indicated 5 missiles. He knew that American strategic doctrine did not contemplate launching only 5 missiles in a first strike. 5 missiles did not make strategic sense as an opening move. The system showed high confidence, but Petrov judged that 5 missiles was inconsistent with what an actual American attack would look like. He reported the alert as a system malfunction. He was correct. A rare atmospheric condition had caused sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds to be interpreted by the satellite sensor as the exhaust plumes of missile launches. Petrov later said that he was not certain when he made his decision. He said he had 50-50 confidence that he was right. He also said that he was afraid, and that he filed his report and waited. If he had been wrong, his report would have been irrelevant, because the missiles would have arrived regardless. If he was right, as he was, his decision meant the Soviet command structure was not triggered. The incident was classified. Petrov was not commended. He was criticized in a subsequent review for failing to maintain his log properly during the crisis. He left the Soviet military shortly afterward. The 10th system to consider is the American nuclear gravity bomb program and the safety record of those weapons during the Cold War. The standard public narrative of nuclear weapons safety during the Cold War is that serious accidents were rare and that no nuclear weapons detonated accidentally. The second part of that statement is technically correct. The first part requires considerable qualification. The United States military acknowledged, in a 1980 document, 32 accidents involving American nuclear weapons between 1950 and 1980 that met the definition of significant enough to report. The document described these incidents using the term broken arrow, which was the official designation for accidents involving nuclear weapons. The incidents ranged from the loss of weapons in aircraft crashes to fires at storage facilities, to one incident in which a B-52 bomber broke up over Goldsboro, North Carolina in January of 1961, dropping 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs. Both bombs went through multiple stages of their arming sequence. One bomb, investigators later determined, had 5 of 6 safety mechanisms fail. A single switch prevented detonation. The Goldsboro incident was classified for decades. When documents related to it were eventually declassified and released, they confirmed what physicists who had reviewed the publicly available information had long suspected. The bomb had come within a single component failure of detonating. A nuclear weapon detonating over or near Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1961 would have had consequences that extend well beyond the immediate area of detonation. The contamination, the political response, the strategic interpretation of the event would all have been significant. This did not happen because a switch did not fail. The switch's continued operation was not the product of deliberate human action. It was a mechanical reality that persisted until the bomb hit the ground. The 11th system involves the American nuclear posture in the Pacific during the Korean War and its aftermath. American nuclear weapons were deployed to Okinawa in the 1950s and remained there under arrangements that were not fully acknowledged to the Japanese government for years afterward. The presence of nuclear weapons on Japanese territory was politically sensitive, given Japan's history as the only nation to have been attacked with nuclear weapons, and successive American administrations maintained official ambiguity about the practice while actual deployment continued. The Okinawa deployments were part of a broader pattern of forward nuclear deployment in the Pacific that created command and control complications of their own. The weapons were closer to potential targets, which shortened warning times and reaction windows on all sides. They were deployed under conditions where the local command structure had authorities that were not always clearly subordinated to Washington. And they were physically vulnerable in ways that weapons in continental American storage were not, because the forward bases at which they were stored were within range of conventional as well as nuclear attack. The 12th system is the doctrine of flexible response as it was actually implemented, as distinct from how it was described in policy documents. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara began articulating flexible response as American doctrine in the early 1960s, the idea was that the United States would have a range of military options short of immediate massive nuclear retaliation available to it in a crisis. Conventional forces would be strengthened. Tactical nuclear options would be more carefully calibrated. The enormous blunt instrument of massive retaliation would be supplemented by more precise tools. In practice, the implementation of flexible response in the European theater created a situation in which tactical nuclear weapons were dispersed so widely across the theater, assigned to so many different units with so many different command arrangements, that coordinated control of them in a rapidly developing conventional conflict was essentially a theoretical construct. The logistics of nuclear weapon accountability in a conventional war situation, with forces moving, supply lines being disrupted, communication systems being attacked, was never worked out in a way that satisfied the planners who looked at it most carefully. The exercises that tested flexible response implementation consistently found significant problems. The problems were documented. The documentation was classified. The doctrine continued. The 13th system is the Soviet Sapphire, which was the code name for a series of submarine-launched cruise missiles developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, some variants of which were equipped with nuclear warheads. The system itself was acknowledged eventually, but what was not acknowledged for many years was the operational profile under which these weapons were maintained. Soviet cruise missiles on submarines patrolling close to American coastal waters created a warning and response problem that was qualitatively different from the intercontinental ballistic missile problem. An ICBM launched from Soviet territory gave American warning systems approximately 15 to 30 minutes to detect, assess, and respond. A cruise missile launched from a submarine position in the Atlantic or Pacific at close range could reduce that window to minutes or even seconds, depending on trajectory and speed. American anti-submarine warfare efforts during the Cold War were, in part, a response to this shortened warning problem. The effort to locate and track Soviet submarines, to know where they were at all times so that the warning problem could be managed, was itself an enormous enterprise that occasionally created its own crises. American attack submarines followed Soviet ballistic missile submarines on their patrol routes with the explicit purpose of being able to destroy them quickly in the event of war. Soviet submarines were aware of being followed in some cases. The interaction between American attack submarines and Soviet ballistic missile submarines in open ocean was not always predictable, and incidents of close approach, near collision, and ambiguous signaling were more common than the public record reflects. The 14th system is the American prompt global strike concept that began developing in the late Cold War period and continued into the post-Cold War era. The idea was to develop conventional weapons capable of delivering precise strikes against targets anywhere on Earth within 1 hour of a launch decision. The concept addressed a genuine strategic problem. Some high-value targets, terrorist facilities, or rogue state infrastructure of various kinds needed to be struck quickly and could not wait for the deployment of conventional forces. But the implementation of prompt global strike created a different problem. A ballistic missile launched from American territory, even if it carried only conventional warheads, would be detected by Russian and Chinese early warning systems as a ballistic missile launch. Those systems could not determine from their sensor data whether the incoming missile was conventional or nuclear. The decision about how to respond would have to be made in the same 15 to 30-minute window that governed nuclear response, and with the same level of uncertainty that had produced false alarms many times before. The 15th system is the Soviet nuclear artillery program, which deployed nuclear-capable artillery pieces to the ground forces in Eastern Europe in significant numbers beginning in the early 1960s. Soviet tactical nuclear doctrine in this period contemplated the use of nuclear artillery in a European conventional conflict as a matter of course, not as a last resort or an escalatory step, but as a routine element of combined arms warfare. Western military planners who were aware of Soviet tactical nuclear doctrine, which was not published openly, understood that a conventional conflict in Central Europe would face an early nuclear threshold that was far lower than American policy assumed. This created a genuine and deeply uncomfortable strategic asymmetry. NATO doctrine, particularly in the early 1960s, contemplated a period of conventional conflict before reaching the nuclear threshold. Soviet doctrine, as best as Western analysts could reconstruct it from exercises and operational documents, contemplated reaching the nuclear threshold very quickly, within the first days of a conflict, as a way of compensating for conventional weaknesses in certain areas. If Soviet forces faced a situation in which conventional NATO operations were succeeding, the threshold for nuclear use was explicitly lower. The practical implication was that a conventional war in Europe might have become nuclear very quickly, and for reasons that Western decision-makers would not have anticipated or understood in time, to respond differently. The 16th system is the American Safeguard anti-ballistic missile complex at Grand Forks, North Dakota, which was the only anti-ballistic missile installation actually built and briefly operated by the United States under the terms of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The installation was activated in April of 1975 and deactivated in February of 1976, a period of less than 1 year of actual operation. The deactivation was authorized by Congress on the grounds that the system was too expensive relative to its capability. The technical problems that had been identified during the system's brief operation, problems related to radar performance, interceptor reliability, and the fundamental difficulty of hitting one missile with another missile, were not mentioned prominently in the public debate. What was less public was the strategic reasoning that some analysts offered against the system even before its construction. An American anti-ballistic missile system that could intercept a limited Soviet strike would, from the Soviet perspective, threaten the viability of Soviet deterrence. If the United States could intercept Soviet missiles, the Soviet nuclear deterrent was less certain. If Soviet deterrence was less certain, the Soviets had an incentive to build more missiles, to improve their accuracy and penetration aids, and to consider preemptive options that might overwhelm the American defense before it could function. The ABM system, intended as a defensive measure, risked accelerating the arms race in ways that made everyone less safe. The 17th system in this account is the British nuclear program and its relationship to American strategic planning. Britain developed its own independent nuclear deterrent, which by the late 1960s was centered on the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile system, acquired from the United States under the Nassau Agreement of 1962. The British deterrent was genuinely independent in the sense that British submarines carried British nuclear warheads and operated under British command authority. The targeting and operational planning, however, was closely coordinated with American planning through a liaison arrangement that was not fully described in public. The independence of the British deterrent was politically important because it provided the British government with the ability to act without American authorization in what British doctrine described as scenarios where supreme national interest required it. In practice, the scenarios that British planners identified as requiring independent British nuclear action were scenarios in which the United States had decided not to respond to a Soviet attack on Western Europe. This was a real concern, not a theoretical one. European NATO allies were aware that the American commitment to extend nuclear deterrence to Europe rested on the credibility of American willingness to trade New York for Paris, and many European officials were privately skeptical that this exchange would actually be made if tested. The 18th system is the Soviet missile submarine program's interactions with American naval forces in the Pacific during the 1960s and 1970s. Soviet ballistic missile submarines operating in the Pacific faced American anti-submarine warfare efforts that were, by the mid-1970s, quite sophisticated. American submarines, using sound surveillance systems and other detection methods, were able to track Soviet submarines with considerable reliability. This tracking capability was itself a form of strategic leverage. The knowledge that Soviet missiles could be destroyed early in their patrol would complicate Soviet planning and might incentivize Soviet submarines to move to patrol positions that were harder for American systems to track. One consequence of this dynamic was that Soviet submarines occasionally operated in positions closer to American coastlines than their standard patrol routes, attempting to complicate American tracking by varying their patterns. These closer approaches created their own incidents. American attack submarines trailing Soviet ballistic missile submarines in confined waters ran a higher risk of collision. There were collisions, some of which became public and some of which did not. The incidents that became public were typically described in terms that minimized their strategic significance. The incidents that remained classified were more varied in nature. The 19th system involves the research and development programs on both sides of the Cold War that explored weapons concepts which were never fully developed, but which generated significant intelligence concern when they were detected. Among these was Soviet research into directed energy weapons, including high-powered microwave systems and laser weapons, that American intelligence identified as potentially relevant to anti-satellite and anti-missile applications. American response to this research included its own directed energy programs, some of which became public in attenuated form during the Strategic Defense Initiative period of the 1980s, and some of which remained classified. The Soviet-directed energy research was taken seriously enough that it shaped American assumptions about Soviet intentions in ways that influenced arms control negotiations. American negotiators in SALT and START discussions had intelligence assessments of Soviet-directed energy programs that they could not share with their Soviet counterparts, because sharing them would have revealed the sources and methods used to collect the intelligence. This created negotiating asymmetries where American positions were shaped by information that could not be explained to the other side, which in turn created Soviet suspicion about American intentions. The 20th system is the nuclear command and control arrangements that existed in China during the early decades of its nuclear program, beginning with the first Chinese nuclear test in 1964. Chinese nuclear doctrine and command arrangements were far less transparent than either American or Soviet arrangements, and Western intelligence on Chinese nuclear posture was substantially less complete than intelligence on Soviet capabilities. What was understood by the late 1960s was that China had nuclear weapons, was developing delivery systems, and had a command and control arrangement that was not well understood by Western analysts. The period of the Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976, created particular concerns about the stability of Chinese nuclear command arrangements. The political upheaval of the Cultural Revolution affected military institutions as well as civilian ones, and the question of how nuclear weapons would be controlled during a period of intense political chaos within the Chinese leadership was not one that Western analysts could answer with confidence. The possibility that Chinese nuclear weapons might be used in ways that were not authorized by any coherent command authority, or that might be authorized by a faction rather than by the state as a whole, was a genuine concern during this period. The 21st system involves the proliferation of nuclear weapons knowledge through channels that were not fully controlled by either superpower. The technical knowledge required to build nuclear weapons was, by the 1960s, available in published scientific literature at a level of detail that was sufficient to guide a well-resourced state program to a working device. The specific design details of efficient weapons remained classified, but the physics of fission and the general principles of weapon design were not secrets by the time the Cold War entered its mature phase. Both superpowers knew this. Both superpowers, nonetheless, maintained extensive classification programs predicated on the idea that keeping certain specific technical details secret was strategically important. What was not fully acknowledged in public was the degree to which nuclear weapons knowledge spread through channels that were not fully controlled. Scientists who had worked on American or Soviet programs moved to academic positions. Papers were published that contained more detail than their authors realized was sensitive. Foreign scientists trained in nuclear physics at American and Soviet universities returned to their home countries with knowledge that was applicable to weapons programs. The A.Q. Khan network in Pakistan, which became publicly known only in the 1990s, was the most spectacular example of proliferation through non-state channels, but it was not an isolated phenomenon. The 20-second system is the one that ties together everything that has come before, and it is not a weapon or a radar installation or a command arrangement. It is the doctrine of deterrence itself, as it was actually practiced rather than theoretically described. Deterrence, as articulated in policy documents and academic literature, is a rational construct. It says that states will refrain from attacking other states when they calculate that the costs of attack outweigh the benefits. Nuclear weapons make the potential costs of attack so catastrophically high that the calculation always favors restraint. Deterrence works because rational actors will not choose actions that guarantee their own destruction. The problem with this construction, the problem that every serious analyst of nuclear deterrence has had to grapple with and that institutional systems consistently managed around rather than through, is that it requires rationality, accurate information, and correctly functioning systems at precisely the moment when all three are most likely to be absent. A nuclear crisis is, by definition, a moment of extreme stress, incomplete information, time pressure, and institutional dysfunction. The command and control systems, the early warning systems, the communication systems, all of the technical infrastructure that deterrence requires to function, were built and operated by human beings and human institutions under normal conditions. They were designed to function under crisis conditions. The gap between those two requirements was filled by optimism, by doctrine, by exercises that could not fully replicate the conditions they were designed to prepare for, and by luck. The luck is the part that the historical record makes most clear. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly across 4 decades, the outcome of a potential nuclear exchange depended on the decision of a single individual who was not part of the formal command structure. A submarine officer who refused to agree, a duty officer who trusted his own judgment over his instruments, a launch crew that followed a procedure that happened to reveal a malfunction before it could be acted upon. None of these individuals were identified by the system as critical nodes. None of them had been briefed on the possibility that they might become, in the span of minutes, the most consequential decision-makers on Earth. They were performing their assigned functions, following their training, operating within their procedural frameworks, and at the moment when the procedural framework reached its limit, they made a human judgment that happened to be correct. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991. The nuclear weapons remained. The early warning systems continued to scan the horizon. The submarines continued their patrols. The silos remained on alert. The institutional knowledge of how to manage deterrence, accumulated over 4 decades, was distributed across 2 successor organizations that were no longer enemies, in the formal sense, but were not fully partners either. The command and control systems that had been built around the assumption of a bipolar confrontation now operated in a world that was multipolar, less predictable, and in some ways more dangerous. The dead hand system, whose continued operation after 1991 is a matter of scholarly debate and incomplete documentation, was not publicly confirmed to have been shut down. The operational status of various Soviet-era nuclear systems in the months and years immediately following dissolution was not fully transparent to Western governments. The treaties that were signed and ratified reduced numbers. They verified reductions through inspection protocols that were technically rigorous and practically incomplete. They established communication channels and confidence-building measures that functioned as long as the political relationship between Russia and the United States remained at a level of cooperation sufficient to sustain them. When that relationship deteriorated, as it did through the 2000s and more sharply in the 2010s, the institutional infrastructure of arms control began to erode. Treaties were withdrawn from. Inspection regimes lapsed. Communication channels that had been established precisely for crisis management were closed or degraded. The systems that were designed for the end of civilization were designed for a world that no longer exists in the form that motivated their design. They have not been redesigned for the world that does exist. They remain, modified and reduced but structurally present, maintained by institutions that inherited them from their predecessors, along with the doctrines, the procedures, the targeting philosophies, and the fundamental assumption that deterrence is stable because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative remains unthinkable. The systems that would implement it have not gone away.